They stood 10 feet apart and watched it happen together. The excavator's bucket punched through the hangar roof, and the whole timber frame beams Booker Vance had raised by hand, snapping like ribs, one after another. A bulldozer swung in behind it, blade down, and shoved his little Cessna sideways across the concrete until the wingtip crushed against the wall. Then the treads bit into the runway apron and tore a raw brown gash right down the middle of it. Diesel smoke, avgas dripping into gravel, a lifetime folding in on itself. Coralie Vandergriff stood right beside him, arms crossed, watching the same thing and smiling. "Stop the machine," Booker said. "Quiet." "Now why would I do that, sir? This is a pilot's community, not a junkyard, and not wherever you came from. That's my aircraft. That's my building." Ass. She finally turned, and the smile was the worst part. "It was an eyesore, and so's that toy plane, and so, if we're honest, are you. You hammered together some old shed and thought it made you one of us. Bless your heart. I signed the demolition order myself, personally." Another beam came down. Booker didn't flinch. He lifted his phone and kept it steady on her face. "Oh, I'm keeping this," he said. "You just confessed on camera to something a whole lot bigger than you think." Stamped across the paperwork she'd tossed in the dirt twice, National Park Service. But to understand how a golf cart tyrant ended up confessing to a federal crime on my phone, we have to go back 3 weeks. To the morning it started with a lavender envelope. 3 weeks earlier, the morning smelled like avgas and old cedar, which, if you've never smelled it, is just about the best-smelling combination of danger and Grandpa's garage a man could ask for. Booker Vance was in Hangar 9 at sunrise, sanding a wing rib down to bare wood, coffee going cold on the bench beside him. Dew still clung to the Cessna's wing out on the ramp. Somewhere a mourning dove was making its sad little case for the day, and under Booker's palm, the wood came up smooth and pale, the way his wife used to say good work was supposed to feel, like the thing wanted to be finished. That hangar wasn't a metal box, let me be clear about that, because Coralie never once was. It was a timber truss training hangar, World War II vintage, hauled to Talon Ridge piece by piece and rebuilt, board by board. Booker and his late wife Delia, the two of them and a borrowed forklift and one long sweat-soaked summer. Like raising a barn full of ghosts, Delia used to say. On the workbench sat his grandfather's toolbox, brass latch worn cool and smooth by 3 generations of thumbs. Grandpa Vance had turned wrenches at a Tuskegee auxiliary field back when the country wanted black men to fix the planes but not to fly them. There was a reason the folks from the state kept driving out with clipboards. I'll get to that. It's the whole story, honestly. Now Talon Ridge Air Park. Picture a neighborhood where the driveways lead to runways, and everybody's got a hangar instead of a 2-car garage. Lovely place. And presiding over all of it from the seat of a golf cart she drove like a parade float was Coralie Vandergriff. Coralie didn't fly. Let that sink in. HOA president of a pilot's community, and the woman had never held a certificate in her life. What she held was the biggest house on the field, a husband named Chip, who'd checked out of the marriage somewhere around 2011, and a 3-inch binder of CC&Rs she treated like scripture handed down on the mountain. The first shot came in a lavender envelope. Smelled like a candle store threw up in it. Surprise Architectural Compliance Review, it said. Which was funny because the review had somehow inspected exactly 1 lot on the entire field. Mine. Citation number 1, my hangar's non-conforming rustic exterior clashed with community aesthetic standards. $250 a week until remediated. I read it twice. Then I did the smartest thing I did all month, and it cost me nothing. I took a photo of it. Because here's the thing about an HOA that writes a rule that fits exactly 1 house on the whole street that's not a rule. That's a target with a zip code. And the smartest first move you've got is proof it exists before it quietly disappears. Takeaway. When a rule fits only your house, it isn't a rule, it's a target. So screenshot it before it vanishes. I wasn't looking for a war. I wanted a quiet retirement, a plane to fly on Sundays, and maybe to teach a couple of neighborhood kids which end of a wrench does the work. That's all. Coralie wanted a different ending. She just didn't know yet whose it'd be. The second envelope skipped lavender and went straight for the throat. A cure or demolish notice. 30 days to bring the hangar into aesthetic conformity, or the association would abate the structure at the owner's expense. And because Coralie liked to belt with her suspenders, she'd slapped a lien on the property for the aesthetic fines I hadn't paid, wasn't going to pay, and legally probably didn't know. I'll tell you what stung worse than the paper, though. 2 lots down, Merle Tibbet had a steel pole barn the color of a bruised roof half rusted, a tarp flapping off one corner like it was waving for help. That week, Coralie approved his agricultural storage variance, smiled while she did it. Brought him a bunt cake. Different rules for different driveways. She never said why out loud. She didn't have to. You could feel the why sitting in the room like humidity. So I stopped arguing about my paint and started asking about her paperwork. I sent a certified letter return receipt, the little green card, and everything demanding the association's books and records. Meeting minutes, the reserve fund ledger, and specifically the recorded vote that supposedly authorized fining me and tearing down my building. In most states, an HOA is legally required to hand those documents over to any owner who asks the right way. And nothing on God's green earth makes a petty board sweat like a man who's figured out the word certified. You don't fight an HOA with feelings. You fight it with their own records, requested in writing. You can prove they received. The gravel crunched under my boots all the way to the mailbox, and I'll admit I whistled. 10 days later, the records came back, and buddy, they told on themselves. The vote to demolish my hangar. It happened at a meeting with no quorum. 3 board members in a 5-seat association, one of them phoning in from a cruise ship. No proper notice to owners. Which meant, technically, legally, the whole demolition authorization was about as binding as a horoscope. I could have called a lawyer right then. Instead, I wrote Coralie a single-page reply, polite as a church usher, pointing out the quorum defect and inviting the board to withdraw the notice, to avoid unnecessary liability. Her response came on the lavender stationery again. I read it out loud to my dog Radar, an old blue heeler with strong opinions. By the second paragraph, something about my attitude problem and failure to integrate into the community culture, Radar stood up, gave me a look, and left the room. Smart dog. See a normal person corrected in writing, backs off. Quietly fixes the vote, covers their tracks. Coralie wasn't built that way. Getting corrected by me, of all people, lit something in her. The next letter didn't withdraw anything. It doubled the fine and scheduled a special enforcement session. She'd decided that if the rules wouldn't get rid of me fast enough, she'd stop bothering with the rules. Which, and I cannot stress this enough, was the single best thing she could have done for my case. Because every step she took from here, she took on the record. And every step I saved. Let me continue the same segment to hit target. She held that special enforcement session on a Tuesday night in the clubhouse, and she made sure I got exactly 4 hours notice. Just enough to say she'd notified me, not enough for me to round up a soul. Clever. Petty, but clever. I showed up anyway, sat in the back. The room smelled like burnt coffee and industrial carpet cleaner, that blue chemical funk that means somebody spilled something and gave up. Coralie ran the meeting like a woman who'd watched exactly 1 episode of Robert's Rules of Order and skipped to the part where she got to bang a gavel. She read her charges against me into the minutes, called my hangar a blight, called my presence disruptive to community harmony. And then she made her mistake a small one, the kind you only notice later. She looked right at me and said, for the record, in front of 9 neighbors, "Some people move somewhere they don't fit and expect the rest of us to lower our standards. That's not happening here. Not on my field." Nobody clapped. But nobody said anything either. A couple of folks studied their shoes real hard. I didn't argue. I just clicked my pen, wrote down the time, the date, and the sentence word for word, and slid the notebook back in my jacket. Some fights you win by talking. This one, I could already tell I was going to win by listening. And writing it all down. When the fines didn't move me, Coralie got creative. And creative on a woman like that is genuinely a little bit impressive to watch, like a raccoon figuring out a latch. Talon Ridge has a shared taxiway, the strip of pavement that connects everybody's hangar to the actual runway. It's a common easement. Everybody's got the right to use it. That's the whole point of buying into a fly-in community. So Coralie called an emergency board action and reclassified the taxiway scheduling protocol, which is 11 syllables that mean this: from now on I needed board approval to tow my own airplane to the runway. Board approval. From a board run by a woman who wanted me gone. Translation: she could ground my aircraft anytime she felt like it and call it paperwork. I found out the fun way. Walked out at 6 a.m. to move the Cessna and found 11 orange traffic cones lined up across the mouth of my taxi lane like a little plastic honor guard. 11. For one man and one small airplane. I stood there in the cold gravel, biting through my boot soles, breath fogging, and I counted them twice. I felt honored, honestly. That's a lot of cones to dedicate to one retiree. So I stopped by the hardware store and I did the second smartest thing I did all month. I bought cameras, weatherproof ones for the hangar eaves, aimed at the taxiway. A cheap doorbell cam pointed right at the cone situation. And here's the part worth knowing: Georgia is a one-party consent state, which means I'm legally allowed to record conversations and activity I'm part of on my own property without anybody else's permission. I checked my state's rule before I mounted a single lens, because the law on recording changes depending on where you're standing. Takeaway cameras don't argue, don't panic, and don't forget. But check your state's recording law first. Then put a lens right where the trouble keeps happening. The cameras earned their keep in about 36 hours. 2 nights later, the doorbell cam caught a board member, Coralie's little deputy, a jumpy guy named Purse, sneaking out at 11 p.m. to move my cones onto my lot so he could photograph them blocking the common area and write me up for it. On video, time-stamped, in a windbreaker that said Talon Ridge Board across the back in case there was any doubt. I didn't confront him. I saved it. You'll see why later. Around then's when Dutch Ferris wandered into my life, and thank God for it. Dutch is a leathery old crop duster, retired 2 hangars down, with a laugh like a lawnmower that won't quite start. He ambled over one morning while I was up a ladder adjusting a camera, squinted up at me and said, "She come after you too, huh?" You could say that. Came after my paint scheme back in '09, said it was visually aggressive. He grinned gap-toothed, so I repainted it uglier, orange and purple, called it visually assertive. She bout had a stroke. He stuck out a hand the texture of an old baseball glove. Dutch. First ally. A man who'd been fighting the same war for 15 years and thought it was funny. I could work with that. Then came the whispers. I started hearing it secondhand at the fuel pump in the clubhouse parking lot. Concerns. Coralie had been going table to table with concerns about who's really operating out of Hangar 9, whether I was properly certificated, whether my plane was even legal. All of it fiction. None of it said to my face. All of it wearing that polite coat that certain kinds of ugliness like to wear in nice neighborhoods. I didn't blow up. I've learned that blowing up is exactly what people like Coralie are hoping for. It lets them make the story about your temper instead of their behavior. Instead, I went home and I typed it all up. Every rumor, who said it, who heard it, the date. And I filed a written selective enforcement and fair housing complaint. Not to blow anything up yet, just to start the paper trail. One violation is an accident. A pattern is a lawsuit. And a pattern you can document is a lawsuit, with your name on the winning side. Don't answer a smear campaign with anger. Answer it with a dated written record, because a documented pattern is worth more than any comeback. Meanwhile, across the field, Coralie had reached a decision. Paperwork was too slow. Cones weren't working. She didn't want to fine the hangar anymore. She wanted it gone. Here's where the story catches up to that morning you already saw. The excavator. The smiling. The little envelope in the dirt. Now you get the whole thing. She timed it perfectly, I'll give her that. She waited until I had a VA appointment 2 hours away, a standing one on my calendar, the kind of thing a woman who'd been quietly watching my routine would know about, and she hired a demolition contractor to abate the nuisance structure while I was gone. By the time I got the call, the crew was already at the gate. The call came from Dutch. Then 2 seconds later, from my phone itself, the hangar camera pinging me a motion alert with a live view of a 40-ton excavator idling on my ramp exhaust, shimmering in the morning heat. I drove back doing things to the speed limit I'm not proud of. I could smell it before I could see it clearly. Diesel and cut grass and something sharper underneath. Hydraulic fluid, hot metal. The excavator sat there, rumbling that deep chest cavity growl backup alarm going beep, 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 like a countdown. The foreman's crew stood around holding coffee, and there was Coralie up on the hood of her golf cart, arms crossed, waiting for me like the whole thing had been staged for an audience of one. Now every instinct I had said run at the machine. Put my body between the bucket and 40 years of Delia's work. That's what she expected. That's what would have made me the crazy man on the news, the one who escalated. I didn't do that. I walked to the property line, planted my boots, took out my phone, and I hit record. And then loud and slow, so the foreman's ears and my microphone could both hear it, I read the bronze plaque bolted beside the hangar door out loud. This structure is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, protected under Federal Preservation Covenant. The foreman's head came up like a deer hearing a stick snap. See, that man had been in construction 30 years. He knew what National Register meant. It meant permits. It meant somebody higher than a homeowners association had a say in whether that building lived or died. He walked over, wiping his hands, and said, "Ma'am, is this thing registered? Because if it's registered, I can't." And Coralie, God bless her, God keep her, leaned into the golf cart's little Bluetooth speaker and said the words that ended her. "I don't care what's bolted to it. I signed the order. Keep going, I'll take full responsibility. Knock it down. I'll take full responsibility." On camera, in front of a witness, about a federally protected historic structure. I have watched a lot of people say a lot of dumb things in my life. I have never watched anyone hand another human being a winning lottery ticket with quite that much confidence. The foreman hesitated. Coralie snapped, "Now, or I'll find a crew who will." He shrugged the shrug of a man deciding this was above his pay grade and below his patience, climbed back up and swung the bucket. The first pull took the corner truss. I want to tell you I stayed stone-faced. Mostly I did. But when that timber came down, the one Delia and I set on the hottest day of that long summer, the one she'd smacked with her palm and said, "That one's not going anywhere," my jaw locked up so hard I heard my own teeth. The wall folded. Dust bloomed up gold in the morning light. The bucket swung back and clipped the Cessna, and the wingtip crushed against the wall with a sound like a soda can under a boot. Some men would have grabbed that operator by the collar. I grabbed the timestamp. Never interrupt your enemy while she's confessing on camera. Your restraint is the evidence. When it was over, one wall gone, the plane wounded a raw brown scar, torn across the shared apron. Coralie looked down at me from her golf cart, satisfied as a cat, and waited for me to yell. I didn't. I crouched at the edge of the wreckage in the gravel and the splinters, and I found a single shard of that old cedar truss. Delia's timber. I turned it over in my fingers, felt the grain, and I put it in my jacket pocket. Then I took out my phone and made one call. I didn't say much, just, "It's done. She actually did it. And Zora, I got all of it." I hung up before Coralie could wonder who Zora was. She'd find out. Everybody would. Zora Bellamy is a historic preservation attorney out of Atlanta, and she is the reason my hangar was standing in the first place. She'd walked me through the grant paperwork years back, when I first restored the place. When I called her from that pile of splinters, she went quiet for a second, and then she said something I'll remember the rest of my life. "Booker, they didn't destroy your property. They destroyed a federally protected historic resource. That's not your problem anymore." A pause. "That's theirs." Let me explain what Coralie never bothered to learn, because it's the hinge the whole thing swings on. When I rebuilt that hangar, I didn't just hammer it together with retirement money. I did it right. The building qualified for the National Register of Historic Places, genuinely historic, tied to the Tuskegee Auxiliary Field where my grandfather worked, and to fund the restoration, I used two federal programs, the Historic Preservation Tax Credit and a Save America's Treasures Grant. Here's the part that matters. Both of those programs, in exchange for the money, record a preservation easement, a covenant against the property. And that easement doesn't expire when I sell. It doesn't care who's on the HOA board. It runs with the land, which is lawyer for forever. It is enforced not by the county, not by the state, but by the National Park Service, the federal government. A federal preservation easement runs with the land. permanently tear down the building without federal sign-off, and you haven't broken an HOA rule. You've broken federal law. So let me make sure I've got this, I said to Zora. The thing that made me a target, the old, ugly, non-conforming building she couldn't stand, is the one thing on this whole field that outranks her entire binder. Booker, Zora said, and I could hear her smiling. Her binder isn't even in the same building as the law you're standing in. I sat down on an overturned bucket. The dust was still settling. Radar came and put his chin on my knee, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I started to laugh the tired kind, the kind that's mostly relief. Then Zora told me the second thing, the thing that turned a lawsuit into a legend. She'd pulled the SHPO file, the State Historic Preservation Office records, while we talked, and buried in the documentation was a note about the original hangar apron, the concrete slab. Turns out that when this was an active training field, ground crews had stenciled the squadron insignia right onto the apron, blue and gold, a winged emblem. Decades of dirt and gravel had buried it. Nobody living had laid eyes on it in probably 50 years. It was still there, under the very grounds Coralie wanted to scrape flat for her precious community green. Booker, Zora said slowly, if anybody ever cleared that lot down to the slab, they'd uncover a piece of documented federal history, on camera, in front of whoever happened to be standing there. I looked out at the torn-up apron, at Coralie's golf cart tracks, at the future she thought she was building. Don't warn her, Zora said. Don't stop her. If that woman wants to keep digging, let's make sure the whole town is watching the day she hits the bottom. I picked Delia's splinter out of my pocket and held it up to the light. For the first time in this whole sorry business, I smiled a real smile. We weren't going to fight Coralie. We were going to let her win. Right up until the exact second she didn't. You don't spring a trap. You build a stage, and you let the other person walk out onto it, thinking the spotlight's for them. So over the next 2 weeks, we built the stage. First, the crew. Dutch signed on for logistics, which mostly meant he sat in a lawn chair near the fence, with a thermos and a pair of binoculars, and reported everything Coralie did, narrating it like a nature documentary. She's approaching the lot. She's gesturing at the dirt. Oh, she does not like that dandelion. The man was in heaven. Zora ran point on the law. She opened a quiet line to the National Park Service's regional office because a documented covenant violation isn't an HOA squabble, it's a federal matter. And the feds like to know when their easements get bulldozed. She also revived my selective enforcement complaint, stacking it with the pole barn double standard and the whisper campaign into one clean pattern. Takeaway 1. Violation looks like a mistake, but a documented pattern of unequal treatment is what turns pettiness into real legal liability. Then there was Dr. Prentice from the State Historic Preservation Office, a soft-spoken man who loved old buildings the way some folks love old dogs. He scheduled an official site inspection, and more importantly, filed the paperwork to formally document the demolition as a violation of the federal covenant. That signature turned my wrecked wall from sad into Exhibit A. And Marisol Reyes, a young reporter at the county paper, hungry, sharp, sick of writing about zoning meetings and 4-H ribbons. I didn't hand her a rant. People like Coralie survive on other people's rants. I handed Marisol documents, the certified letters, the quorumless vote, the video. And I pointed her at the HOA's finances and said, "Go pull the public records yourself. Don't take my word for anything." She did, and what she found was better than anything I could have told her. Coralie had paid that demolition contractor out of the HOA's reserve fund, the community's savings, the money that's supposed to be for repaving and roof repairs, with no valid board vote authorizing the expense. That's not just against the rules. In most states, that's the kind of thing that makes individual board members personally liable, not the association, them, their own houses, their own bank accounts. Takeaway boards act like the reserve fund is their money to spend, but spend it without a valid vote, and you can be personally on the hook. So always check who actually authorized the check. Now for the stage itself. And I want to be real clear because I know how these stories go. I did not build a booby trap. Nobody got hurt in my plan. That's the whole difference between me and Coralie. What I built was an invitation. I upgraded the cameras, added a little motion-triggered trail cam aimed straight at the apron. And then one evening, with Dutch keeping watch, I did the quietest, most important piece of work in the entire plan. I took a garden trowel and I carefully cleared away just enough gravel and dirt to expose one edge, one corner of that buried squadron insignia. Blue and gold, sharp as the day it was painted. Then I loosely brushed the dirt back over it, hid it again. But shallow now, waiting. If Coralie sent her crew to scrape that lot flat for her community green, their own blade would peel back the dirt and drag that federal emblem up into the daylight in front of God and everybody. Take away the best trap is the one your opponent springs herself, convinced the whole time that it was her idea. And the timing was a gift. The airpark's annual fly-in and Founders Day was 2 weeks out, and Coralie, never one to miss a chance to hold a microphone, had already announced she'd unveil the newly cleared lot as a brand new community green at the ceremony. Press invited, the county commissioner invited, ribbon scissors, the works. Same stage, same crowd, same ribbon. We just planned a different rabbit. The montage of those 2 weeks lives in my memory as a smell mostly 3-in-1 oil, because I spent the evenings cleaning and oiling my grandfather's toolbox, working that brass latch until it moved like new. Dutch calling plays from his lawn chair, Zora's emails landing at 2 in the morning, Marisol's tape recorder clicking. She was planning a ribbon cutting. We were planning a magic trick. Here's a thing about people who bully from behind a binder. The second they smell real trouble, they don't get careful. They get frantic. And frantic people leave fingerprints everywhere. Coralie could feel something moving. She didn't know what. Reporters were calling the HOA's management company. Dr. Prentice's state car had been spotted at the fence line. So instead of slowing down, she stomped on the gas. First, she brought the contractor back to finish grading the lot before Founders Day, so it'd be smooth and green and photogenic for her big moment, which meant she was with her own money and her own orders, sprinting directly toward the one patch of ground I most wanted her to disturb. I nearly sent her a fruit basket. Then she tried the county building inspector. Word got back to me through Marisol Coralie had been very friendly with an inspector named Hollis, hinting around about whether a demolition permit could get dated back a little, backdated so it'd look like she'd had authorization all along. A little grease for the wheels. What she didn't know was that the SHPO had already contacted Hollis's office about the covenant violation. So Hollis smiled and nodded and looked into it and documented every single thing she said to him. She thought she was buying a cover story. She was buying a second charge. The gravel out there was cold enough those mornings that it crunched like breakfast cereal, and I'd stand at my fence with coffee, just listening to her dig her own hole, one careful, expensive scoop at a time. And then, because 2 fronts weren't enough, she opened a third. The smear went into overdrive. Suddenly, to the neighbors, I was litigious. I was difficult. I wasn't a team player. I just wanted to cause problems. That polite, laundered vocabulary that certain people reach for when they can't say the real thing out loud in mixed company. She even circulated a petition to restore community harmony, asking neighbors to formally support the board against disruptive litigation. I didn't sign anything. I didn't argue with anybody. I didn't post a word. I just kept feeding time-stamped evidence to Zora and Marisol and let the woman keep talking. And here's where it turned quietly, the way real things turn. The harmony petition backfired, because when Coralie went door to door asking people to sign against me, she made a lot of folks stop and actually think about their own Coralie stories. The variance she denied, the fine that appeared out of nowhere, the time she reviewed somebody's mailbox. Dutch didn't just refuse to sign. He started a counter letter, and neighbors lined up for it. The Petronellis, whose fence she'd fought for 2 years. The widow Okafor, who she'd fined for excessive garden gnomes. One by one, the field started quietly turning against her, and she was too busy digging to notice the ground shifting under her. The lavender letters, meanwhile, had graduated from weekly to daily. Radar had fully unionized against the smell of them. He'd hear the mail truck and go stand by the back door and protest. And Deja, one of the 2 kids I'd been teaching about airplanes, 12 years old and sharp as a tack, started keeping a tally chart on the hangar's surviving wall. Citations on one side, Mr. Booker's moves on the other, like a scoreboard. She looked at it one afternoon, counted and announced, "You're winning 14-0. "She doesn't know it's a game yet," I said. "That," Deja said, "is the best part." 2 days before Founders Day, Zora called with the last piece. The National Park Service regional officer would be attending the event. So would a sheriff's deputy from the county. Both officially to observe. I hung up and sat out by the wounded hangar as the sun went down the exposed rafters black against an orange sky, and let myself breathe. All that was left to do now was let her win, right up until she didn't. The morning of Founders Day came up pink and clear dew burning off the grass, and by 7 a.m. the field was already transforming. Folding tables, bunting in red, white, and blue, a banner going up over the ramp. Talon Ridge Founders Day, sagging in the middle, the way banners always do. Somebody was setting out donuts. The smell of coffee and fresh-cut grass drifted across everything. And right on schedule, cutting through all that Norman Rockwell like a wrong note, came the diesel growl of the excavator back to give Coralie her spotless lot. She was out there personally directing it. In a blazer. Cream-colored, sharp, dressed for a ribbon cutting she was sure she'd be the star of. She stood at the edge of the lot, gesturing at the operator, and because the woman had learned exactly nothing, she said it loud enough for 3 tables of early-arriving neighbors to hear, and loud enough for the camera Dutch had propped on the fence. "Scrape it clean. All of it. Down to the dirt. I want grass here by noon." The operator dropped the blade and pulled, and the earth gave up its secret. The blade peeled back a long strip of gravel and topsoil, and there it was. Coming up out of the ground like a bruise healing in reverse, blue and gold, a winged squadron insignia stenciled onto the original concrete apron 70-odd years ago and hidden ever since. Sharp, unmistakable. Federal history dragged into the morning sun by Coralie Vandergrift's own hired blade, exactly like Zora said it would be. The scrape of steel on that old concrete cut across the whole field, and half the donut table turned to look. The operator saw it too. He stopped cold, killed the swing, and leaned out of the cab, staring down at what he'd just uncovered. Dutch from his lawn chair cupped his hands around his mouth and called out cheerfully, "Ma'am, I do believe you just dug up a federal monument." Now watch how fast a bully's morning falls apart when the props stop cooperating. Coralie marched over, saw the emblem, and I watched the color leave her face in real time. Because even she knew that was something. She just didn't know how big. The contractor knew, though. He climbed down, took one look, and said the 4 words that ended his part in this. "Where's your demolition permit?" She didn't have one. Never had. He started packing his tools right there. And then Marisol arrived, notebook out, photographer beside her camera already clicking, at the exposed insignia at Coralie, at the whole tableau. That's when Coralie made her final, fatal, beautiful mistake. She panicked. And in front of a working reporter, a photographer, and 40 neighbors setting up for a party, she pointed at the emblem and ordered the departing crew, "Cover that back up. Now get some dirt on it. Cover it up." Trying to rebury a documented federal historic resource. On camera. In front of the press. Somewhere off to the side, I heard Deja mutter, 15-0. I didn't run over. I didn't say a word. I walked slow to where Zora was standing by the fence with her phone to her ear, and she lowered it, met my eye, and gave me a small nod. "They're here," she said. Because pulling into the gravel lot behind us in no particular hurry were 2 vehicles, a plain government sedan with a federal plate and a sheriff's cruiser. The National Park Service officer stepped out first, settled a folder under his arm, and looked across the field at the freshly uncovered insignia with the particular expression of a man whose paperwork just came alive. And Coralie, cream blazer, ceremonial scissors already in hand, oblivious, turned away from the crew, fixed her smile back on, and strode toward the podium to give her speech. She had no idea she was walking straight into the last 5 minutes of her reign. Picture the whole field now. 100-some people, pilots, wives, husbands, kids with balloons, the county commissioner in a golf shirt, Marisol's photographer down on one knee for the angle, the sheriff's deputy near the back, and that National Park Service officer quiet, front and center, folder under his arm. Behind the podium, roped off in bright new caution tape that nobody remembered stringing up, I'd done it at 5 that morning, sat the half-scraped lot, the squadron insignia gleaming up out of the dirt like it had been waiting 70 years for exactly this crowd. Coralie tapped the microphone, that ugly little feedback squeal, and she began. Good morning, Talon Ridge. What a beautiful day to celebrate our wonderful community. Applause thin and confused. As many of you know, we've been working hard to improve our field, and I'm proud to unveil the site of our new community green right here, where an old eyesore used to stand. And then she did it. The thing that told me she still didn't understand anything. She gestured magnanimously gracious, a queen bestowing sunshine out toward me in the crowd. The same little flick of the hand she'd used to shoo me like a fly 3 weeks earlier. As if I should be grateful. The crowd didn't clap. The energy in that field was wrong, and she was the only person standing in it who couldn't feel it. That's when Zora stepped up beside her and gently took the microphone. Before anybody cuts a ribbon, Zora said, warm as anything, I think everyone deserves to understand what's actually sitting under that caution tape. She held up 2 documents. This structure the hangar Miss Vandergriff had demolished is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and this is a federal preservation easement recorded against this land. Permanent, enforced by the National Park Service. A murmur started rolling through the crowd. The Park Service officer stepped forward and confirmed it in that flat, unbothered voice government people use when they hold all the cards. The hangar and the apron were federally protected. The demolition was a violation of a perpetual federal covenant carrying civil penalties and recapture of the historic tax credits. And, he added, looking mildly at Coralie, attempting to recover a documented resource this morning may compound that. Coralie's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Then Marisol did the kindest, cruelest thing of all. There was a monitor set up beside the podium meant for the ceremony's slideshow, all those nice photos of the field. Marisol simply queued up different footage. The crowd watched Coralie on screen lean into her golf cart speaker 3 weeks ago and say, I don't care what's bolted to it. Keep going. I'll take full responsibility. Then, this very morning, well, it clean. Cover it back up. And then last the clip from the demolition, her voice crisp in the microphone. Not a junkyard and not wherever you came from. That one landed like a slap. The murmur went dead silent, then came back low and dark, and it was pointed at her now. Every face on that field had finally heard in her own voice the things she'd spent a year saying quietly. Neighbors who'd shrugged it off looked at their own shoes, then looked at her, and something shifted for good. The sheriff's deputy walked up and handed Coralie 2 pieces of paper, a federal violation notice and a county citation for demolition without a permit. No handcuffs. This was never that kind of story. Just paper, but paper with the whole weight of the United States government behind it, delivered in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. Then Dutch stood up out of his lawn chair. I move, he said, loud and happy, to remove Coralie Vandergriff as board president, effective right now. Hands went up across the field. Not a few, a forest of them. The Petronellis, the widow Okafor, Merle Tibbet of the ugly pole barn even. And when the vote came, Chip, her own husband, studied the horizon and kept both hands jammed firmly in his pockets. I finally walked up. My only trip to that microphone the whole story. I took Delia's cedar splinter out of my jacket and set it on the podium. And I looked at Coralie not with hate. I was past hate. Mostly I felt sorry for her. You spent a year trying to prove I didn't belong here, I said. Turns out the only thing on this whole field older than your rules is my family's. I set the splinter down, and I walked off. The field erupted. Somewhere in the noise, a kid let go of a balloon, and it drifted up over the roped-off insignia, shining in the sun. The emblem my grandfather's squadron wore back when this country wouldn't let him fly. Coralie just stood there. Cream blazer diesel smudge on the sleeve, she never noticed ceremonial scissors still in her hand. She never did figure out which of us they were pointed at. The rest went fast, the way these things do once the dam breaks. Coralie was out removed that same afternoon, made official within the week. She and her 2 rubber stamp board members ended up personally liable for the misused reserve funds and their share of the federal penalties, which is a sentence I enjoy typing more than I probably should. Chip lawyered up separately, which tells you everything about that marriage, and the lavender letters blessedly stopped. Radar took it as a personal victory and celebrated by sleeping for 11 hours. Here's the part I like best, though. The county and the National Park Service reached a settlement, and the terms were poetry. The HOA, the same association Coralie had run like her own little kingdom, was ordered to fund the complete restoration of the hangar. Every board, every truss, every panel. Coralie's demolition bill became the community's rebuilding fund. Play stupid games at the federal level, win federal-sized prizes. And the neighbors showed up. That's the thing that still gets me. Folks who'd spent a year avoiding eye contact came out with tool belts and coolers and pickup trucks full of lumber. We rebuilt that wall board by board, the way Delia and I built it the first time, except now there were 30 of us, and Dutch supervising, which mostly meant standing in the shade telling everybody they were doing it wrong. Deja and her buddy drove the very first nail, bent it flat. We left it in there on purpose. It's still there. The smell of that summer was avgas and fresh-cut cedar, together sawdust in the sun, and it smelled like getting something back. We didn't stop at a hangar, though. I turned the place into the Vance Aviation Heritage Center, named for my grandfather, and every mechanic like him who kept those planes flying without ever being allowed to fly them. That squadron insignia in the apron, we preserved it right where it lay under a pane of glass set into the new floor. So you walk in and there it is, shining up at you. And we started a youth flight scholarship for local kids who love airplanes and can't afford the first lesson. Deja's already got her eye on it. Founders Day is still a thing at Talon Ridge. It's just a different thing now. It's a heritage fly-in and a scholarship fundraiser, and last year 140 people came, and not one of them drove a golf cart, like a parade float. I hung Delia's picture by the door, right next to the National Register plaque. The same plaque Coralie's excavator couldn't touch. She always said that old girl would outlast the whole neighborhood. She was right about both of them. The morning after we finished the rebuild, I stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee gone cold, and I watched the first scholarship kid climb into a Cessna for a discovery flight. The tick, tick, tick of the engine warming up, the smell of avgas, the propeller catching the light. And I thought about a man who fixed planes he was never allowed to fly, and his grandson who flew them, and this kid who was about to, and I figured we were probably square with history now, or getting there. Oh, one more thing, because I know how this place is. Coralie wasn't the only one at Talon Ridge with a secret. You remember Merle Tibbet Uglypole? Barn the one Coralie always let slide. Turns out there was a reason she left him alone. Turns out he'd been quietly buying up empty lots across the field under a shell company for about 6 years. And turns out he wasn't done. But that's a story for next time. If you've got your own HOA horror story, the fine that only fit your house, the rule that got invented overnight, the board president who mistook a binder for a badge, do me a favor and drop it in the comments. Somebody down there has already beaten it, and the rest of us would sure like the playbook. And if you want to find out how the pole barn shell company thing shakes out, trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. Go ahead and subscribe. I'll keep the coffee on. So that's how it ended. A woman with a golf cart and a 3-inch binder went to war with a retired Air Force mechanic and lost to a plaque she never bothered to read. But let me sit with you for a second, because the part that stays with me isn't the excavator. It's what Booker Vance didn't do. He didn't yell. He didn't throw himself in front of the machine. When Coralie was tearing down 40 years of his life, he did the hardest thing a person can do when they're angry. He reached for his phone instead of her collar. That's the whole thing right there. Because Booker understood something a lot of us learned too late. You don't beat petty power by out-shouting it. You beat it by out-documenting it. A screenshot of a fine that only fit his house. A certified letter she had to sign for. A $250 a week penalty that meant nothing next to a federal easement that had been sitting on that land the entire time. She had a binder. He had the United States government. And he waited, patiently, quietly, until the whole town was watching before he let her find out the difference. Patience isn't weakness. Sometimes patience is just a trap that hasn't sprung yet. And here's why this one probably hit home for you. Most of us have a Coralie. Maybe not with an airplane hangar, maybe it's a fine over the wrong shade of mailbox, a rule that appeared overnight, a board that treats the reserve fund like a personal checking account. That feeling of being pushed around by someone whose only real authority is that nobody's checked their paperwork yet. So let me ask you straight, if that excavator showed up at your property line, would you have kept your cool long enough to hit record? Be honest with yourself. It's harder than it sounds. If you've got your own HOA story, the fine, the rule, the board president who mistook a binder for a badge, drop it in the comments. Somebody down there has already beaten theirs, and the rest of us want the playbook. Hit subscribe because Cora Lee wasn't the only one at Talon Ridge with a secret, and the next one already started buying up the whole field before anybody noticed. Do it right. Keep your receipts. And never let a small person with a big binder convince you that you don't belong. We'll keep the coffee on.